So I'm going to hit go live and we'll see.
Okay, go live.
Okay. Okay. You're live now, it says.
Now we're live. All right, well, this is why we're doing this. Okay, I will start over. Welcome to the Golden Shadow. This is our first attempt at a live stream on YouTube. We're interested in doing this more often, but we don't quite understand the technology yet. And we want to make sure that this runs smoothly. So this is going to be kind of a test run.
Yeah, have some patience with us as we're testing out this new tech. And also, if this seems like something you're interested in us doing more, like monthly live streams, talking about different topics, let us know in the comments. We're always interested in trying out new things. So YouTube Live is another iteration of that. And this is our first time.
So if you have any questions about anything related to the podcast, any topics we've already covered, anyone that we've talked to, go ahead and drop those questions in the chat and we'll try to answer them. There's no guarantee that we will answer any and all questions or that we'll go in order or anything like that. I kind of wonder if we're going to get any questions at all this time, since this is just a new thing, but there you have it. So in addition to Q&A, today we're going to talk about Jungian typology. And this is a topic that we've covered quite a bit already in the podcast. We've devoted at least 3 videos to it.
Yeah. If you're interested in typology and you don't have the basics, the podcast episodes are a really great place to start because we walk through the different attitudes and functions, giving, I don't know, probably at least nearly 45 minutes to an hour for each one. And I think what's important to keep in mind if you're interested in this topic, or even if you've been studying it for a while, is that it's pretty complex. It's a quite extensive theory. And I think that there are ways that you can understand it on more basic surface levels. But the more you kind of pierce deeper into the typological theory, I feel like sometimes the more confusing it gets. So have a little bit of patience and grace with yourself as you learn, because it's really a slower process of really integrating what it means, how it applies to yourself. And it's really typical just to feel pretty confused when trying to get into the depth of complexity that typology really is.
Right. So people are familiar with these concepts already, probably because of MBTI, Myers-Briggs personality types, and they are based upon the ideas of Jung. They're based on Jungian typology. I can't speak to how much they really waver from Jung's ideas. Maybe you can speak to that, Alyssa, a little more.
Yeah,
MBTI is sort of a variation.
Yeah,
or
and
an appropriation of it, maybe.
It's definitely a development on the theory, but from my understanding, Myers and Briggs, which is a mother and daughter pair, were already working on some sort of personality system, but then Jung's collected works, 6 psychological types, came out, and I think they realized that here was a guy who figured something out. And so they took a lot of his work, the functions and the attitudes, and implemented into this system of something that was meant to more be like a typing indicator, and it sort of grew to be what it is. So certainly there is a line of connection between Myers-Briggs and Carl Jung, but he was not involved with the development of the MBTI. And if anything, maybe would have looked down a little bit on what it's doing, which is sort of reducing the typology theory into a rather quick testing activity, and then giving somebody a label, and then they go off and do what you have with it. I think with Jung, the practice of typology was born from both his clinical work, but also observing all the differences in individuals around him and in himself, these kind of unique characteristics that both patients and friends, colleagues had. And the process really of utilizing typology, especially in analysis or in therapy, is to really get into the nuance of how your psyche works, how it orients to reality. And you can actually approach then the therapeutic process or even different dynamics in your life with a little bit more awareness and consciousness, understanding that there's like a typical way that you interact with the world.
Right. So typology is useful because you can understand the reasons that people misalign so much. Mostly, I think, is the main use, because there's so much conflict in our lives, and there's so many ways in which our relationships fail repeatedly. And typology helps us understand that a lot of these miscommunications and conflicts and failures are really due to a misunderstanding or a sort of misalignment of energy, and that it's not as simple as one person being right and one person being wrong. There really is just, you're approaching this problem from two different perspectives, and you're both right. But you can't see that you're both right, strangely. So this is tough work. I think to really get into the typology and make sense of it is difficult. And you need to, I think, already kind of have a background, at least, in thinking about psychology, thinking about these ideas, wondering why people are different, wondering about the kind of different patterns we see. Like, there are different kinds of people that seem to all kind of group together. Like, oh, I know someone who's kind of like Bob, and I know someone who's kind of like Cheryl. And paying attention to those patterns, I think, has to be kind of a precursor to this, because the concepts do get difficult.
Yeah.
So it is kind of like a philosophical system almost, and that can make it tough because it gets so abstract so quickly. But a lot of these concepts people are at least kind of familiar with, right? Like introversion, extroversion is the attitude, and most people have heard introversion or extroversion. They probably use the words themselves, and even so, I think there's still a lot of confusion about what that actually refers to. And there is the danger, as you said, with MBTI, sort of the danger of reduction. And that's what's tough about typology, is you have to kind of counteract a kind of reductive tendency, which is you want to say, okay, well, introverted people, they're people who like to be alone. And extroverted people are people who like to be with other people. That's it. And that's misleading. And it can actually be kind of the opposite at times, depending on who you are, and depending on the situation, depending on the scenario. So what do we mean by extroversion and introversion, Alyssa?
Yeah.
Just review that really quickly.
Yeah, I think the simplest way to think about them is like the direction and flow of psychological energy. Like, not only where do we draw energy from, but where we invest it, and also where we naturally seem to turn towards. And so extroversion is external. The focus is towards the outer world, or towards outer concepts, or towards external dynamics. And introversion is internal. The flow of energy is going inwards towards the subject, and that's going to get you more into that internal space. So outward focus, inward focus at its most simple and fundamental. It's important not to get trapped in thinking about extroversion and introversion as merely social dynamics. Like, I'm an extroverted person. I like to go to parties. I like to hang out. I like to be around people. That's a nature of a certain type of extroversion, but not across the board. It's merely outward focusing towards the outer world, towards the object, away from you. And introversion is going to go inward towards the internal space.
And extroversion?
So extroversion, when we're looking at extroversion, it's that focus on the external, and that's going to be an orientation towards the collective, that concern with external systems, desires to kind of be in the mix, to be influenced, to influence others. It can bring a sense of outgoing personality and being very accommodating. But you really are going outwards into the external world when extroversion is a top attitude for you.
So the first letter of the personality types is extroversion or introversion. And so if your personality type starts with E, that's referring to extroversion being your top function, or the top attitude on your stack. right? And if you're an I, as in an I, if like INTJ, that means the top function has the attitude of introverted. So your primary or dominant function is either E or I, and that's the first letter of the personality type.
Yeah. One thing when you start to really get into the nuance of not only the type code itself, but into the stack of functions is that that top E or I code that you have is just the first tool in the tool belt that your psyche will use. And it needs to be balanced out secondarily by its opposing attitude. So people might do a Myers-Briggs or similar test and get a type code and say, oh, I'm an ENTP, but they also feel like they have lots of introverted qualities. Well, that's because within us, we have extroversion and introversion. We have all of the functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. So you're not purely an extrovert or you're not purely an introvert. And I think just realizing that initially at the get-go can be really helpful as you learn typology.
Right. And thinking and feeling, and we can just go over this really quickly because we don't want to do a full review here, but the attitudes are extroversion, introversion, and there's 4 functions, right? Thinking and feeling are on one axis, sensing and intuition are on the other axis. Thinking and feeling, this is a little more familiar, I think, as an idea, but there is a sense that thinking there's kind of like an elevation thing. I enjoy this sort of metaphor. There's sort of an elevation to thinking and feeling, whereas the thinking means you're kind of up high in abstraction area. That's where your mind tends to go. It tends to objectify the world. It tends to kind of systematize and interpret the world as a place of objects, which makes you very powerful at problem solving, and you can understand how things work really well. You can abstract out of yourself to kind of take a bird's eye view or an objective view. Whereas feeling, there is kind of a more grounded in the body, more in touch with needs, more in touch with your own needs, more in touch with the needs of others. Dare I say, you're a little more human. You're a little more in touch with the humanity of people, and you're kind of vibing and resonating with that. So thinking types tend to be people who might be more kind of in like an engineering sort of pattern of interpreting the world. And they are able to problem solve and take apart puzzles and understand things in a kind of more objective way. But that kind of means that they can be sort of ungrounded and sort of outside of themselves, outside of their own feelings. They might not even know what it means to kind of like feel, say, I am experiencing sadness or I am afraid, things like that. Whereas someone who is more feeling is more in touch with what's going on in themselves, more grounded in themselves, and is probably paying more attention to how others are also feeling and grounding them. And the sort of social resonance of feeling is just more pronounced than it is for thinking. Agree with that?
Yeah. And I think you say that as a thinking type. So I think often when we talk about that natural way that thinking sort of abstracts out of itself, and that can make it seem a little less human-like. It's not to say that they're completely disconnected from emotions or the feeling realm, but these functions exist on an axis. And naturally, when you're in one, you're sort of suppressing the other. And so to be fully in thinking, especially if it's a dominant function, means that that feeling space just gets pushed further and further, but it still informs who you are as an individual. You will still tap into that at times, but you don't have as a refined access to it, which means when you get into your feelings, it might come off as a little bit more erratic, wild. You might kind of, get into some sort of angry spiral or depressive state, things like that. So that's happening across the board, no matter which of your functions are dominant.
Right, and sensing and intuition, a little more difficult to unpack, I think. The way I tend to think of it is that sensing and intuition, again, they're on an axis. You can kind of lean more heavily in one direction. If you're kind of more intuitive, you might be leaning away from being sensing, and vice versa. They're kind of a trade-off. Sensing, the axis here, I kind of like thinking and feeling are kind of like this elevation, I think, of like high up in the clouds versus being grounded in your body. Sensing and intuition kind of has more of a depth feel to it to me, whereas sensing is kind of more concrete and here and now. It's very, I wouldn't say surface level or shallow, but there is a sense of like what you see is what you get. What is real is what I can hear and touch and taste. I want to hear facts. I want things to be practical. I want you to just tell me the facts. I don't want to hear any sort of weird metaphorical language. And that's in contrast to intuition, which I think is kind of, there's a feeling of being, it's seen more deeply into reality. And there's a sense of not being here, not being now, but kind of being more into a future or past or potential world. It's kind of more symbolic and metaphorical. There is a kind of sense of intuitives being more in touch with the unconscious. They can't give you the facts always, and maybe they don't want the facts from you. Maybe they're operating in kind of a more sort of a dream realm. And that doesn't mean the dream realm is fake or false. It just means that they're sort of seeing the patterns that are behind the more concrete, explicit patterns. They're paying attention to what's going on sort of behind the scenes instead of paying attention to what's right in front of them. And there's a trade-off there, right? Because if you are a very intuitive type, you might seem kind of aloof or absent or daydreaming. You might not be here. You might not be aware of your surroundings. That might even translate to you being someone who is very clumsy and like walks into things because you're just like, you're spacing out, as opposed to someone who is more sensing, who might be very practical, very hands-on, very present, very good at sort of being in the moment, maybe more in touch with their bodies in some sense, so they can be more like athletes, musicians, good with their hands, but at the expense of sort of seeing deeper and seeing beyond. And so sensing types might be kind of like no nonsense, no bullshit. And you might try to talk to them about sort of mystical ideas or religion or the kind of symbolic realm. And they might just say, well, that's all baloney. Like, none of that's real. And that can be a weakness as well. So it just depends. Neither are bad or good. They have like shadow sides, I guess you might say, certain strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah. I think at times it can feel like these different functions that kind of exist on these axes, the dichotomies, are in such a clash with each other that they really can't find common ground. But I feel often what is more typical is that they create a really dynamic balance, a kind of like yin and yang, so that when you have somebody who might be more of a sensing type, they can cover more of that grounding, more of the facts, stay rooted in reality, don't jump off the deep end into potential and possibility land. But then you need someone also who can kind of go into that more abstract space, like an intuitive type can, who kind of senses inherent possibility and can brainstorm all of these new ideas. So together they really can come in harmony. Same with thinking and feeling. And you might consider, even in your own life, other people that feel really, really different from you, and sort of start to parse out, do you think it's because they are more thinking, feeling, or sensation, intuition compared to yourself? And it can help just to ground it in reality when you think about the people in your own life and how you either, come into conflict or how you balance one another out.
All right, should we take a question from the chat?
Yeah, sure.
This is from Milenko. Try to answer this the best we can, but I'm not quite sure what the question is speaking to exactly. But how do you think alchemy and mysticism fit into Jung's typology? And I think at the very least, Jung had a very refined philosophical system that he was working on his entire life. So I do think they're all related in Jung's mind. I think alchemy and mysticism are related. I think they're both related to his typology. I think they're all sort of interacting and mutually sort of reinforcing each other as far as his ideas go. Alyssa, you've thought a little bit more about alchemy recently, for sure.
Yeah.
What would you say?
I think there's a couple of different ways to answer this question. And first, I like what you're bringing up about this kind of grand unified theory that is analytical psychology. And what ultimately is going on, whether Jung is studying mythology or religion or alchemy, or creating a theory like typology, is the revelation of the unconscious. What are the dynamics that make up one's psyche, both that higher top level of ego consciousness, that which we are aware of, but also the depths, the unconscious space. And in alchemy, he found through not only the text itself, but the emblems, the imagery, the symbolism, that there was this process going on of psychological development. And that was being projected into this material process of alchemy. And so we can look at some of the aspects of the alchemical opus and see the development of psychology, of the confrontation with the shadow, encountering the unconscious, the kind of rising and integration of a new principle coming into ego. But we could also see some of those elemental operations, which you can kind of tie, at least create a bit of a correspondence back to typology. So if I'm going to draw some really direct lines, I think it's interesting, not 100% perfect, but it's interesting to connect the operations of calcinadia to intuition, so fire element to the kind of fiery intuition, to connect solutio, water, to feeling, to connect sublimatio, air, to thinking, and coagulatio, earth, to sensation. And this is something that's explored a bit too. And I know someone asked about books, and maybe I'll show a few during our live stream. Anatomy of the Psyche by Edward Enninger, really incredible Jungian analyst, explores the 7 different alchemical operations and does connect some of those typological functions into the operations. But when we think about a lot of the symbolism that tends to come up with something like the solutio function, which is water. We see a lot of flooding, deep bodies of water, baptismal dynamics. You also see that connected to the feeling realm. And when we get into the feeling space, we're often going into those still waters that run deep. An individual who can tap into those deep aspects of the feeling space and connect into both unconscious aspects, but also the relational aspects. So you can see some of the correspondences if you want to draw those parallels, if you want to create more of that connected system. And so that's just to say that even within a system like alchemy, you're going to see other aspects of analytical psychology. You can look at it through an extroverted or introverted lens. In general, alchemy was pretty introverted process. It was a lot of internal work. It was a lot of work done in solitary, no other individuals around the alchemist, or maybe just one helper or another. And so you can think about it in those terms as well. What did the extroverted nature of alchemy look like? It was maybe the things actually being produced, being shown to patrons or to some lord of a castle, or creating dyes or a glassware, things like that. So I think that's one way to look at it. But ultimately, it's just about the psyche. It's just about the nature of psychology, and that we can look at it through a lens of typology, or through a lens of myth, or through a lens of alchemy. But it's all going to reveal patterns that kind of weave throughout all of these different systems.
That at least answered part of your question, or at least was interesting. Another question from Adam at Melon Glass. The question is, if we spent more time on life and less time on economics, do you think the understanding of a meta language will affect a larger demographic? The example of fantasy has mirror privilege in space. The way I'm interpreting this question is, if people spent less time trying to survive and less time trying to make a living and less time in the hustle and bustle of the working world, and had more time for other things, when they have a sort of positive effect on people's spiritual lives. And you can see people's life patterns, I think, pretty clearly, which is that the first half of life for a lot of people is often about taking care of business, making a life for yourself. It's very economic. You have to make money. You have to have a place to live. There's all these basic needs that you need to take care of in the first half of life. And then when people have achieved that, there's a sort of turning inward that happens naturally, where people only then, when they've figured out their economics, can they actually start to begin to explore their spiritual life. And people do reliably. That's what many people do when they retire, is their life gets very spiritual. They find religion, they develop all these new practices, and they have a kind of awakening in some ways that helps prepare them for a kind of slowing down, a sort of receding in some sense, and ultimately death. And that can be a really important process in the later half of life. But it's tough because a lot of people can never get to that place of being economically sound. And so they never have a chance to explore their spiritual life, and they never really have a chance to kind of turn inward and figure out, what is life actually about? Who am I? So before they have a chance to sort of make sense of life, they have to live. And that's strange, right? It seems kind of backwards. It's like, well, it would be more ideal if we could somehow make sense of life, develop a good philosophy of life for ourselves, have this spiritual toolbox that we developed, and then actually start living. It would be nice. Instead, it's kind of backwards. So young people have to make a choice. And I think that's unfortunate. You kind of need to make a choice of going the economic route, and your spiritual life will probably suffer because of that. And your spiritual life might never actually develop at all if you go for a very economic route and get a good job. Or you can sacrifice economics for a spiritual life. And, I'd say in many ways, that's what I've done. And I've paid for it economically. And it's unfortunate. And so I think if you can imagine some kind of like utopian future, for instance, where people don't really need to work as much, which I think is hopefully where things are going. You would have thought that 50 years ago, like, oh, by the year 2000, no one will have to work because machines will just do everything, right? And that's not the case. Everyone is still having to hustle their ass off to make ends meet. Not everywhere, but most places in the world. But if people get to a place where they don't need to work as much, there can be more time devoted to spirituality, and it would be good for people's health. It'd be good for people's mental health. It'd be good for, world peace, things like that. And that's why I think it's a good aim to get to a place where people don't have to work so much and they can actually focus on their spiritual life. But we're clearly not there yet. I think the pandemic lockdown has had an interesting effect in this way, because it has made a lot of people turn into their spiritual life and try to figure that out. And you can see there's a little glimpse of possible change of people becoming more spiritual and working from home, so they don't have to hustle so much to get to the city, and they can spend more time developing themselves. But it's hard to know what the future holds. So those are some thoughts based on that question.
I guess a few more things to add to that from my point of view is, it is a privilege certainly to have the time and space and energy to work on these things. But at times in our life, the psyche, the unconscious space, the shadow, it doesn't really care about that, like what's happening in mundane reality, that you're not sleeping well and you're overworked and you've got to, upkeep this and that. There's a way in which I think we can become like flooded, when the neurosis hits, in which we have no choice but to try and handle what's happening inside of ourselves. And I think there's probably a lot of mental health issues that continue to become exacerbated because, something inside of ourselves is trying to push into consciousness to be known, and we just don't have the time or space for it. So life goes on. The demands of reality continue to, knock on our door, but at the same time, so do those internal aspects. So it's about finding this balance between the two, about going inward and recognizing where you can get help and assistance or how you can support yourself through those processes, but also having to maintain that external life. And sometimes just utilizing these theories like typology can just put some grammar and some structure around those things about why do I keep, bashing my head into a wall with this type of person? Why do I keep finding myself in this situation? Why do I always slip up like this, which causes this to happen? And now I repeat a pattern. Typology isn't going to be the map that makes everything clear, but it's another tool that I think can help assist you in facilitating this process of personal development and enrichment, and hopefully releasing some of those pressures that you feel like you're under throughout the day.
So getting back to typology, covered the attitudes, extroversion, introversion. There's 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, intuition. And these all make up a stack. They combine and you get kind of a stack of function attitudes. Function attitudes meaning each function, for instance, thinking, has a attitude, which is extroversion or introversion. So you might be a extroverted thinker on top of your stack, followed by an introverted intuitor, followed by a extroverted sensor, followed by an introverted feeler, right? So an extroverted thinker is going to have introverted feeling, and an introverted sensor is going to have extroverted intuition. Did I say that right? I think I said that right. Anyways, and then you have a stack, and that stack is usually 4 things, and that makes up your typology, right? So, for instance, I am an INTJ. That's what we think, at least, and it's important to remain open to the idea that maybe your type is not what you think it is. You have to keep exploring it, figuring out what does an INTJ actually behave like? What does it actually look like? Because you might think you're something entirely different. And I thought I was something different for a while. But now that we've sort of researched the types more deeply, oh, nice.
Can you see
great.
it? Okay.
Yeah.
Testing out new things. So hopefully you can see the stack breakdown. Is it working?
I don't see why it wouldn't be working.
Okay, cool.
We have a delay. So, but yeah, it's showing up.
Okay, sweet.
But for instance, INTJ, that's me on the top right. I don't think you can see the lettering very well because it's the quality is so bad. But there's a stack, right? There's something on top, which is intuition, introverted intuition in this case. There's a second attitude function, or function attitude, excuse me, which is extroverted thinking. So going this way is into, I'm not sure, am I being mirrored? I'm not sure which way is which, but one way is extroversion, one way is introversion. For the INTJ on the top right, the intuition is to the left, so it's introverted. Below that is the thinking, which is extroverted, so it's leaning to the right. Below that is feeling, which is leaning to the left, introverted, and then sensing, leaning to the right, which is extroverted. And you can see each stack has this pattern of alternation. The thinking and feeling are opposed in some sense, and the intuition and sensing are opposed, and that creates this sort of symmetrical pattern.
Yeah, I think when people really see this imagery, it starts to really hammer things home. That when you take a Myers-Briggs test or whatever, 16personalities.com, and you're like, oh, I'm like an ENFJ, I'm just like an extrovert feeling type. It's like, no. It's much more nuanced than that. And then you see that you're actually made up of all of these pieces, and that your primary function, which is being expressed, yes, in the type code, extroverted feeling, is only that top main tool, and that you actually have access to all of these other things. Otherwise, you'd be completely imbalanced and one-sided individual. So then you can start to move through the stack and really ask yourself, well, in your case of being an INTJ, you naturally move towards introverted intuition, but that's being supported by extroverted thinking. And yes, you have a feeling function too, and that's introverted feeling. And at the very, very bottom there, that tiny little circle, S for sensation, so that's going to show up in a much more inferior way. And that's a place for opportunity. That's a place for growth. That might be where a lot of shadow aspects are. So, look this kind of stuff up online, see actually what your type breakdown is. It brings a lot of nuance. And I think also thinking about typology in the function attitude. So not just I'm a thinking type or I'm a feeling type, but as an extroverted feeler or an introverted sensation. When you combine the attitude and the function, I think that's where you really start to get into the nuance of the theory. And it starts to make more sense, because an extroverted feeler versus an introverted feeler is a pretty different type of person.
So the pattern of INTJ is what? How would you describe an INTJ, Alyssa?
As an individual.
The stack that we have here.
Yeah.
Introverted intuition is on top.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, introverted intuition is a very subtle type of function to have, because intuition naturally is a perceiving function. So it's not going out and kind of ruling more of that like decision making, kind of manipulating of the more judging functions like thinking and feeling. But it's really how you're interacting with the world, taking different dynamics in, and in this case sort of pattern imprinting, creating this really deep cohesive system of symbolic understanding, possibilities, patterns. Introverted intuition allows for an individual to go really deep inside of themselves and to kind of create this dynamic system where lots of implicit information is flowing in, and they're just kind of understanding how things typically play out. That's a big part, I think, of what intuition does. It's a pattern detecting function, and that can make it seem that because you become so highly skilled at it as a dominant function, that especially introverted intuitives tend to feel like they know what's kind of happening in the environment before it happens, because you're drawing upon this kind of deep well of understanding. You get a kind of intuitive hit from the unconscious space that says, this is what's going to happen next. So this makes an individual with introverted intuition a little bit willing to entertain that more dreamy potential realm, the abstract space, and to kind of consider all of the possibilities, the kind of natures of reality, the natures of systems, in this case especially, really flow within the INTJ. But that introverted intuition that is kind of seeking potential and possibility and building it as a very deep internal system, wants then to apply that and support that with extroverted thinking, which is all about the external rational intellectual space. It's everything that's the kind of agreed upon systems of anything from like the philosophical intellectual realm down to like hard science. The thinking function loves things that are proven, that have evidence-based, facts that you can follow and create a system and engineer it and create something that's going to be even more proficient. So this type is highly engineering, but doing so in a really dreamy way. It's not just by the facts of reality and that's it. They're going to more see the potential in individuals or see the potential in a system or within a group and try to engineer things to be more productive by kind of moving things around, changing it, looking at the facts of it, making decisions that aren't going to be driven by like the emotional, relational dynamics in the situation. So I think this type is often called the architect. Is that right?
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your type? How does it feel like to be
type?
INTJ?
What does it feel like to be INTJ?
Yeah.
From my perspective, And this differs from INTJ to INTJ, but my experience of myself is that the intuition, the introverted intuition, is incredibly strong, as it should be, because it's the primary, it's the first function attitude. And introverted intuition feels like there's a lot of vision, there's a lot of energy, very fiery, a lot of knowing of something that could be. There's a lot of potential that I'm sensing constantly. And a lot of that potential has to do with what I could do, what I could become, what other people could become. There's the kind of introverted sense to it. Like it's very focused. It's very sort of inward in a sense, but there's that potential.
I want to actually like interrupt for a second, because I think you're touching on a part of introversion that's really important, is that it's focused. With extroversion, quick sidebar, it's like sometimes like the scope is so large. And when you think about extroverted intuition, it's like everything they're seeing as possibility is applied to like a whole wide range of things. And that's why they can be a little bit scattered, or they can jump from one potential to another. Introversion like brings the focus in. And so introverted intuition is not going to be as flighty. It's going to want to hold on to that dream, that potential a lot longer. And that affects the INTJ and the INFJ's personality.
Right. And since we're getting a question from Hal about Beebe's typology, I'll work this into my explanation of INTJ. So the dominant function in introverted intuition for me is sort of the heroic function. And to me, that means that the heroic function is the most conscious. It's the thing that is the most driving. It's the thing that's most pushing. It can be kind of the primary way in which I approach my reality. And there is sort of there's a great light to it. It's very shining. It's very much present. It's kind of the main tool in my toolkit for approaching things, understanding things, how to live. That's introverted intuition, that kind of deep vision, that fire burning, that potential to become. There's a lot of feelings of becoming and changing over time and being very dynamic with introverted intuition. The secondary function attitude, which is extroverted thinking in the INTJ, that works for the primary function. So my extroverted thinking is the parent, or the good parent in Beebe's typology, in the sense that my extroverted thinking is parental. It is a kind of guardian. It's a protector. Because it's extroverted, it's also what tends to sort of interact with the world most explicitly. If people look at my behavior, what they're going to see is the thinking, because the introverted intuition is sort of hidden because it's introverted. They don't see it quite readily. Whereas the extroverted thinking is on the outside. So it's very much like, oh, Arran's very extroverted. Look at what he does. But they can't actually see the intuition because it's introverted. But because the thinking is secondary, it's parental. So it kind of works for the intuition. It protects it. It figures out how to solve intuition's problems. Intuition wants something. It wants to achieve something. And thinking figures out how to do it. So it's kind of in service of intuition. It kind of works underneath it, protects it, encapsulates it, and kind of is the sort of emissary, you might say, of intuition as far as going out into the world and figuring out what to do for intuition. If we go next to the feeling, that's the tertiary function for me, which is going to be introverted feeling. This is sort of the child or the puer archetype in Beebe's typology. And it resonates with me a lot, that framing, because the introverted feeling for me is something that it feels kind of suppressed. It feels like it's not developed very well. It feels like it's kind of beneath these other functions. Intuition's really strong. Thinking is there to support intuition and is very strong and present. Feeling is kind of hidden. It doesn't come out readily for me. The inner child doesn't come out to play very easily. And the sort of more needs-based, human-based The feeling side, it's kind of more social and kind of resonating with sort of basic needs and kind of grounded in like what, emotions. That side of me is not very present, and it's underdeveloped. It can be kind of immature, and that's why it's kind of the child. So I'm much more of a thinker. That's what I use to solve every problem. That's the way I interact with the world. Feeling is kind of the way that I can kind of manifest if all my problems are already solved. If it's safe and there's nothing to do and I feel totally open and free, feeling can kind of come out to play like a little child. But most of the time he's inside and he's protected by the thinker. And then the last one, which is the animus, that's going to be the fourth or inferior function. In this case, extroverted sensing. And this function attitude is immature because it's inferior. It's not developed. It doesn't really seem to be very integrated, which is why sensing patterns for me, which is like a lot of like bodily stuff or kind of being present here in the moment, or maybe even things like organizing my room or my living space, those things are all kind of underdeveloped. They're immature. They're not very present. And so for me, what does that look like? In some ways, it looks like I have a weird relationship with my health. I don't eat very well. I don't really like being on a kind of like exercise routine. I keep myself in shape, and like it's not like I'm unhealthy, but like I have a weird relationship with like junk food. Sometimes I drink too much. Sometimes I oversleep. There's kind of this weird sort of detachment from taking care of my body or being present in my body in some ways. Even though I'm a very physical person, even though I'm an athlete, even though I'm a musician, there's still kind of this weird, immature, unintegrated side of sensing for me. And the animus way that fits in is sort of interesting because it's kind of like I almost find extroverted sensing to be attractive in girls. So I'm attracted to women, and I'm attracted to women who are sensing types. And it's almost like I'm searching for my anima in women because they will make up what I am lacking. So the kind of notion of like, if in dreams, sometimes I'll have female figures in dreams come along and they'll actually lead me places like a psychopomp. They'll interact with me and they'll kind of like bring insights or say like, come with me on a journey. There always seem to be kind of like a sort of sensing personality type. You might say like an ISFJ or something like that. Anyways, that's kind of girl I'm attracted to, which is interesting because it's like, oh, okay, that's my anima. So that's kind of how Beebe's typology plays into the INTJ in some ways. And I hope that explanation makes sense. Obviously, there's a lot more to it. I haven't explored Beebe's typology as much as I could. Lori, as far as the trickster archetype goes, the trickster archetype is like really powerful in me. And Beebe actually has that at the seventh function, the seventh function attitude, which for me would be extroverted feeling. But there is a feeling association with trickster. It's like the trickster comes out to play occasionally, especially when I've been drinking. And that's interesting. Who's the trickster? Why is he there? Usually he's hiding. He can't come out because it's not appropriate. Like it's business time. But when it's safe to come out, he does, and he can cause havoc, or just have a good time. So
yeah, I think one way we see your feeling archetypes play out is that the FI puer seems very sensitive. It's like that part of you, that kind of eternal child that has that feeling toned sensitivity to the world and doesn't quite feel like it knows how to interact, or it can become very easily wounded. Like the part of your feeling space that's your own, connected to your needs, your ability to kind of state those things. It feels both very innocent, but also like very vulnerable. And the more trickster side, which exists in like the shadow personality. So that's going to be like functions 5 through 8, because Beebe actually looks at having all 8 functions stacked. So it's like an expansion on the theory of typology. Is like the trickster for you then is extroverted feeling. And when your tricksteriness comes out, especially as you mentioned, like if you've been drinking, you love to like play with people. You extrovert towards the relational realm pretty hard, except it's just coded with this nature of like poking fun or, finding the weak spot, just like, trying to annoy people, but it's very fun loving, trying to kind of like, gather the energy together, but doing so in that really trickstery way.
Yeah, it's very immature.
Yeah.
Which is, descriptive of a seventh function way, way deep down.
Yeah.
Lori had a question before
Yeah.
we got into that, which was how fixed are the types? Is it the case that when the most of this is decided at a young age, and if it is decided at a young age, is it better to explore your type and its shadow, or is there some value towards working towards other types? And I think this is a good point. Why don't you go first, Alyssa, since I've been talking so much?
Yeah, I am of the camp that your type is fixed, that the way your psyche has the blueprint of it, what you're born with, what is natural to develop is going to fall into one of these types, or at least like the first emerging function is going to be something like extroverted thinking or introverted sensation, etc. And you sort of see the development of personality over time. What I think happens more often than not when people kind of feel like, oh, I've done a lot of inner work and like my personality type has like changed, it's that either you scored as like the wrong type because the tests are like extremely flawed, which is something we haven't been able to touch upon yet today, but it's really hard to figure out your type. Just like disclaimer, it's really, really tough. And relying purely on a online test is likely to get you sort of close, but you might also be totally off base. So your type is fixed. It's important to really figure out what yours is and to have that patience of figuring it out. It is something that might change in the sense that you identify as one, but as you start to actually learn the nuance of function attitudes, you might actually realize you're something else. And one example I'll give is that I often tested as a split between ENFJ and INFJ. So those are really similar. If you look at the picture up on the screen, you'll see that they're made up of the same function attitudes, but the first two are flipped. And it was kind of tough for me initially to figure out, am I an ENFJ or am I an INFJ? Most of my friends say, yeah, you have this really extroverted nature. Like you come into a situation, you take care of things, you are often like the host of a party, taking care of all of, people's needs, things like that. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. People really feel and interact with my extroverted feeling. But what they don't know about me is that I actually have this deep introverted intuitive quality that has always driven my life. From the time I was very young to every important decision that I make, it's all based on this deep intuitive knowing. The way that I interact with the world is carried by the potential and possibility of introverted intuition, but nobody understands that quite as much, and it can happen that people who have a dominant introverted function, that people might not fully pick up on that because, of course, it introverts, it goes inward. And if you have what seems to be a more stereotypical sociable personality, like FE, extroverted feeling, you might get mistyped. So it's important to really do the self-work and to learn the function attitudes and start that way and commit to at least one type and be open to possibly switching it around a little bit. But yeah, types don't change. They can be affected by things like trauma and other environmental dynamics, but I am of the mindset that the blueprint is set in place from the moment you are born.
Yeah. It's a nature nurture question, which is always very gray. It's very complex. It's hard to parse out what is nature and what is nurture, how much of this is innate, built in, versus some sort of experiential or environmental pattern that's been inflicted upon you, et cetera, et cetera. I think that personality types are trying to take aim at what your nature is. It's trying to take aim at like, who were you born to be? And I think a lot of Jung's ideas surrounding individuation are kind of getting at that, of trying to seek out who you really are, or who you're really meant to be. And that's almost something that's kind of preordained. You're sort of meant to become someone, and you're not there yet, but you can work towards that. At the same time, it's really hard to say who I'm meant to be. Some people's characteristics, someone who might be overly thinking, let's say, is that who they're meant to be? Or are they actually just operating out of some kind of trauma where they're out of touch with their feeling types? And you can get into conversations with people where they feel very defensive about the idea of being told they're not who they are meant to be yet. It's like, don't tell me who I am. And you can say, well, clearly, like, you could become a better, more balanced person. You could be happier. And they say, don't tell me like that I'm not, like, don't say there's something wrong with me. It's like, well, we're not trying to say it's something wrong with you. We're trying to say that you could become who you are meant to be, who you're destined to be. And that's, it's complicated, it's problematic. But, I think there's a lot of value in exploring your shadow side of typology and trying to integrate that. And so if you are an overly thinking person, I think there's a lot of value in exploring your feeling side, your feelings in general, and trying to discover strategies of how to get more in touch with my feelings. And that's what I've tried to do. And that's something I've been working on a lot in the last 5 years, especially, is trying to sort of let go of thinking so extremely, even let go of intuiting so extremely, and try to get back into my feelings, my vulnerability, my openness, my gentleness, thinking about people in a very human way, resonating with people in a very social human way, instead of trying to kind of always sort of engineer everything. And so all the functions that are very pronounced, they might be inflated. Let's say you might have a very inflated function or attitude, and you might have a very deflated function or attitude. And for me, I would say my feeling side is very deflated, and I need to kind of find a way to pump it back up to get to a place that I would say is balanced. And, ideally that's true for all of us, is that we're really trying to integrate the shadow sides, the deflated attitude attitudes, excuse me. And I think that's a good goal. So yeah, it's a complicated question. And I think that it needs to be explored. If you're working with typology, you have to explore how much is nature, how much is nurture, and why. And it's just an ongoing process that I think could keep going your entire life, and probably should go in your entire life. So
I'm going to throw out another book. Once again, because people always ask me what books I recommend. This is Lectures on Jung's Typology, with lectures by James Hillman and Marie-Louise von Franz. And they get into some really interesting content during this book, mostly like what can happen when somebody is like raised in a situation in which a certain function is honed in on by like the family environment, and then like pulled into an individual, so that if, say, they're naturally a feeling type in a house of thinking types, that they might unnaturally start to develop this function, even though it might be inferior for them. And that can create a kind of distortion of personality, which at a certain point, you're going to have to kind of come back around and focus more on those other functions that were bypassed in the process. And this can happen in all different ways. But if you're someone who's kind of had more of a natural development of personality, as Arran was saying, like for feeling, that is something that's a little bit deflated in him. It's much lower in the stacked. It is probably pretty intensely suppressed by extroverted thinking, which is extremely intense, powerful function attitude to have. So that path of growth and development and individuation, you might say, is going to be turning towards those lower functions before even getting into shadowy 5 through 8 to build the introverted feeling pillar, and then to work with the extroverted sensing inferior, and then start to get into all of those other ones that you might be able to touch upon a little bit. And, reality is probably like you'll never have full grasp on any of the 8 completely, but it gives you a kind of roadmap, a sort of hazy roadmap to say, okay, if I'm an INTJ, I know that I struggle with introverted feeling, extroverted sensation quite a bit. So what does it look like for me to develop those, to take care of myself better, to, state my needs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's other ways in which a kind of more wholeness of personality can be expressed, and that then you seem much more balanced. You're not so one-sided then on thinking and intuition, but as you grow and mature and work with those functions, suddenly you have greater access to all 4, and you can work with them more readily.
One last question from Lori, and then I think we're going to close it out because we're past the top of the hour. The question is that book the best place to start, or would you recommend a different Typology 101 book? Or best to go direct to source? Alyssa is definitely want to answer this. I would say going direct to Jung is going to be difficult, and there might be an easier place to start. That's what I would say. Yeah,
I'm like trying to turn, and I should have pre-grabbed all of my books. Give me a second. Okay, I agree.
Just so many books, so many options.
I love all the books. Okay, hold on. Here's another one. I don't think I'm getting all of it. Okay, so first and foremost, get Collected Works number 6, Psychological Types by Carl Jung. It's a really thick book. It's over 500 pages, but it's great. The first 9 chapters are him like exploring this idea of typology through all different sort of both philosophical, like actual individuals looking at mythologically. He's always sort of trying to prove his theory, and he's going to walk you through all of these different areas and then tie it all together. Maybe we should do a live stream. What is Carl Jung's personality type? Because that is quite the controversy. And I think you and I have pretty strong opinions about what Carl Jung probably is. Spoiler alert, I think he's an INTJ.
You gotta make him tune into the next one.
If you want to know why. Anyways, this is not an easy book. Any of Carl Jung's books from the Collected Works are kind of difficult. You really need to get used to the way he talks. He's always like peppery in like Latin and Greek and all sorts of stuff. But there is also chapter 10 is really where it's at. This is where he really goes into all of the functions. And then there's also definitions in the back, which are really helpful. So have the source material, but then have all your support books, such as lectures on Jung's typology, von Franz and Hillman, John Beebe's energies and patterns and psychological type. This is going to go both into his 8-function model, but it's also going to give you some of his ideas behind what typology is all about. I also really like Mark Hunziker's work. He both expands on and is sort of nestled under Beebe's 8-function model, but is like a real Jungian in my book. He's not an analyst though. And this book, he also has another one that I don't have, but check it out on Amazon. That one's also good. I have a PDF version. And then there's this other really interesting little book here about nope, that's the wrong one. Here we go. The Questions of Psychological Types. This is like a series of correspondences of Carl Jung as he was figuring out psychological types. And there's some really interesting insight into this. So that's where you can start. Get Collected Work 6, and then get something else to support you through it. There's probably some other books I'm missing.
We'll post a list of these books in the description of the video.
Yeah, so like that's a good idea.
Look these up more easily.
And there's a lot of really good free content online as well. So
always, including this podcast.
Yeah, that's right. Check out our episodes. Extroversion, Introversion, thinking versus feeling, sensation versus intuition. And sometimes we teach workshops on typology. We taught one fairly recently. So head over to goldenshadow.org, sign up to our newsletter. and head over, especially to my social media page on Instagram. I write a lot about typology. I've got a highlight. So I'm always talking typology. I love it. It's one of my favorite subjects.
All right. Thanks to all the questions that we got, and all the interactions in the chat have been very interesting.
Yeah, it's been fun.
It's been fun. This experiment, I think, was successful, and I'm thinking that we will probably do live streams not too infrequently. So stay tuned for more live discussions and live panels. I think Dialectical Tarot will probably be a live stream later next month.
Next month, yeah.
When we talk about the Emperor. So that should be interesting.
Yeah, and let us know down below. Leave a comment. Did you like this format? Do you want to see us do another live stream? We're just always looking for feedback. So let us know what you thought, or any future topics that you'd like to see us cover in an upcoming live stream.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.